Everybody. Welcome back to The Reason We Learn. I'm Deb Philman, mom, homeschooler, educator. Today, I want to talk about disrupt text and the canon and teaching literature to children. It does go hand in hand with the whole discussion of the woke invading our schools and K-12 indoctrination because it's part of the same effort. It may not seem like it on the surface, but it is. It's all part of the same effort. Whereas the direct attack approach is the, confront your whiteness and bankrupt your privilege and all of those things. Um, Racial justice lessons in the explicit sense, taking apart the hierarchy of knowledge and disrupting texts is part of undermining what we learn and how we look at the world, what our worldview will be, as I will explain using this article by Amna Khalid. This was published January 12th. I meant to bring it to you earlier, but got caught up in reporting on, or co-reporting, I guess, on some of the things that Chris Rufo was doing. So let's get into this, and I'll explain more about why this is a problem. The article is entitled "Poverty of the Imagination: Disrupt Text and the Problem with Teaching Literature for Social Justice." And it is a problem. It's a big one. I don't know if you parents have noticed your kids in high school in particular, but also middle school, are reading less in general. They're reading less literature. They're not reading necessarily as a group as we did when we were kids. And by we, I could mean anyone from, I'm Gen X, but let's say even possibly millennials might still have been reading a book with their classmates, like To Kill a Mockingbird, to use this example, or The Great Gatsby, or who knows, any number of other things. That has gone by the wayside. I mean, my own children, my eldest is 17, was in an honors English program at her high school that was supposedly a great public high school. She only went there for 1 year, but still, I was appalled at the list of books they gave the kids to choose from. And first of all, they weren't honors level books. Second of all, they were mostly pop culture and or social justice. It was only those two categories. No literature that I would have pointed to. No classic literature. And they weren't reading as a unit. They weren't reading together. They weren't sharing the experience. They weren't discussing it. They weren't asking questions about it together to learn from each other or explore themes. It was just on their own. And I thought that was sad. The one thing they did read together was an audiobook. And they also read Romeo and Juliet, but they used one of those versions where it's in plain English. I can't remember what they call it, but it's kind of a dumbed down Romeo and Juliet. I don't understand the point of reading Shakespeare if you remove the Old English. It's not even poetry anymore. It was just prose. So I don't even see the point because it's kind of a stupid story. I mean, I say it, it's really only valuable because of the quality of the writing and the figurative language and just the way he describes the whole thing is what makes it good at all, because we could all pretty much agree it's more than a tragedy. It's kind of dumb. But anyway, my point is, you've probably noticed that things have changed in the way they teach literature, and it's intentional. And it's not just because it's hard. I know there are teachers who say, well, it's difficult and all the kids can read at the same level, blah, blah, blah. No, that's not why. It's hard for them to teach social justice. It's hard for them to achieve the goals they're trying to achieve using literature. In fact, using literature would impede their goals. So they don't. So here she says, even Homer gets mobbed. This was the title of a recent Wall Street Journal opinion piece that set in motion a social media kerfuffle about the literary canon and censorship, specifically whether a group of educators associated with Disrupt Text really do want to ban books such as The Odyssey, The Scarlet Letter, and The Great Gatsby. In response, a cascade of tweets characterized these educators as book burners, hell-bent on trashing the classics. But the educators also had their defenders. Some contested the book banning allegations and some contested them and championed the work of Disrupt Text for challenging the white Eurocentric canon. The online frenzy fit neatly into familiar culture war battle lines, with defenders of great books pitted against proponents of a more expansive multicultural literary canon. And while the question of what books are taught is clearly important, the question that should really draw our attention is how books are taught. This is the key. What books we teach, that's important. But part of the reason we choose the books we choose is that they enable us to teach certain specific lessons, or they enable us to teach critical thinking, et cetera. So when we opt out of teaching those books, we're also opting out of a teaching methodology. That's very important. Disrupt Text is representative of a broader growing movement in K-12 education to teach literature through a social justice lens. With all these lenses, I just picture like lots of bug-eyed glasses or some kind of, I don't know, steampunk goggles everywhere. Every time I hear lens, that's what I think of. With an emphasis on centering. There's that word, centering. It's so creepy. The voices and experiences of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, authors, and students. Informed by anti-racist pedagogy, what we call social justice lit is committed to reimagining, another word I can't stand, the traditional canon in order to create a more inclusive, representative, and equitable language arts curriculum. Its ambitious mission is nothing less than to create English language arts curricula that dismantles systems of oppression. Just think about that goal for a second. If you really believe there are systems of oppression, the idea that taking apart the English language arts curriculum in public schools in particular, but also all schools and even colleges, that is somehow going to dismantle oppression, that's where we go, that's where we start, that's how we do it, it's kind of laughable. I mean, maybe over a long period of time, I guess, but if it's going to work quickly, then you have to start asking questions about, what ideas are you inserting in there? So you can't just be dismantling, because just saying we're not going to read Homer anymore, and we're not going to read To Kill a Mockingbird, and we're not going to read The Great Gatsby, and we're not going to read these books anymore. We're going to read, Brown Girl Dreaming instead. How about that? That'll dismantle oppression. It's laughable. Like, how would that even work? Okay. As such, Social Justice Lit asks students to focus on how texts support or challenge issues of representation, fairness, or justice, and whether they perpetuate or subvert dominant power dynamics and ideologies. You can see representative examples in the social justice lit approaches here. She's got all these links. There are two big problems with social justice lit that greatly diminish how students study and understand literature. First, in its current form, social justice lit is promoting a cult of relevance that advances an extremely narrow vision of what kinds of texts will engage and inspire students. Second, it is encouraging a tyranny of presentism in which literary analysis revolves around interpreting and judging texts based on 21st century socially progressive values and concerns. This has been my problem with it all along, and it started a long time ago. They've just put a name to it, Disrupt Text, but this has been going on for a long time. I would say even before my daughter was in that school, probably at least 10 years. This idea that something written by people who are now dead is not worth reading, or something where you have to look up a bunch of words because there are words, there are concepts, there are descriptions of situations, there are people living and functioning in roles that we no longer live and function in, is, we don't do that anymore. That has no relevance to my life. That's how we judge the literature, is if we're different from the people pictured in the literature or described in the literature, instead of looking at themes, instead of looking at, lessons or messages about things like loyalty or betrayal or honesty or even just truth, things that stand the test of time. We're teaching our kids the opposite lesson. We're teaching them only read something if it's very specifically relevant to you in your life, and otherwise it's, you shouldn't care about it. How does that even fit in with diversity, equity, and inclusion? So the guiding assumption behind social justice lit is that the canon is for white people, by white people, and about white people. Dominated by dead white men, it necessarily excludes and alienates BIPOC students. According to Disrupt Text, the notion that we teach Shakespeare because his work is universal or timeless is a shameful rationalization, but it's not. It happens to be true. Instead, Shakespeare's exalted place in the literary canon is really about white supremacy and colonization. No, it's not. I mean, you want it to be, because that will justify getting rid of it so you can supplant it with your progressive indoctrination messages. So you have to make up a reason why it's bad, because in order to get rid of something that people have treated as really, really good for hundreds of years, classics, around which whole departments at universities have been built and entire PhD theses have been written, in order to toss that out like that really quickly to achieve your goal, you have to make it bad. You can't just say, hey, let's also do this. Because somebody might say, yeah, I don't know. If I'm comparing Shakespeare alongside of, say, Ibram X. Kendi. I'm going to go with Shakespeare. I'm going to go with Bill. Um, just for quality and everything else. But you can't do that. You've got to make it bad. You've got to make it damaging. That's why they're doing it. The biggest knock against Shakespeare and the traditional canon in general is that the work is not relevant for today's students. Indeed, relevance in the sense of teaching books in which students' own lives are reflected is social justice lit most sacrosanct value. A high school teacher from Sacramento, California explains, I'm not supposed to dislike Shakespeare, but I do. And not only do I dislike Shakespeare because of my own personal disinterest in reading stories written in an early form of the English language that I cannot always easily navigate. Oh, it's hard for we. Oh, it's very hard. We have to use a dictionary. I'm so very sorry. This is a teacher. This is a teacher. How about looking as a challenge? I've read the Canterbury Tales in the original Old English. It was hard. Oh, it was hard. It wasn't always fun either, but I'm really glad I did it. It was a challenge and I learned a whole lot. Yeah. Okay. But also because there's a world of really exciting literature out there that better speaks to the needs of my very ethnically diverse and wonderfully curious modern day students. So we put all this flowery, nice language around it. It makes it sound like we're just adding this wonderful, amazing stuff. And that other stuff is old and hard and it's not relevant. Let's get rid of it. But that's not how it works. And it's, if you think about it, it's really insulting to these kids. She's saying, like they're creative and they're wonderfully curious. And okay, so do both. If they're so wonderfully curious, why aren't they curious to know how people wrote in Old English? Why aren't they curious to know what life was like way back then? Why aren't they curious? Oh, that's right. We can't possibly show them progress. I'll get to more of that in a minute. But if you look at Social Justice Lit's list of recommended books, it's immediately apparent how narrow their definition of relevant is. Young adult fiction focusing on issues of race and identity make up the overwhelming majority of selected texts. It's formulaic. I guarantee you there are authors sitting home going, let's see, how do I get published really fast? I'll write about the plight of somebody of color in an urban area and somebody's against them and they have, blah. They're an activist. They have to be an activist to get what they need. It's very formulaic. Somebody is angry. Somebody does something that, right the wrongs, and this is the book. These are books such as Brown Girl Dreaming, The Hate You Give, Frankly in Love, books that social justice lit educators believe will represent and validate the experiences and cultures of their students. Why do they need to be validated? I don't read the things I read, nor do, people say, oh, that's just easy for you to say. No, it's true. I don't pick up a book and read it. What exactly about F. Scott Fitzgerald validates me or my existence? It doesn't at all. In fact, there's a lot of books I could read, which, let's look at Edgar Allan Poe and, some of his darker tales. Like, what in the world about that validates me in my existence? It doesn't. They're just really good stories. So that's just a lie. So I don't love the way they put words in other people's mouths. I don't love the way they put thoughts in other people's heads. They make blanket assumptions. They treat people as a monolith, and then nobody stops them. Nobody stops them and says, but no, that's me. That's my job. That's what I do. I come on here and I say, no, that's not it at all. Anyway, novelist and literary critic Zadie Smith has eloquently contested the social justice lit premise that readers will have a natural affinity and appreciation for books written by authors that look like them. She likewise rejects the idea that authors should write only about people who are fundamentally like us, racially, sexually, genetically, nationally, politically, personally. On Shakespeare's thrilling multiplicity and his remarkable capacity to speak simultaneous truths, Smith writes, in his plays, he is woman, man, black, white, believer, heretic, Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Muslim. To pin him down to a single identity would be an obvious diminishment, both for Shakespeare and for us. Thank you. So true. In a similar spirit, Ralph Ellison observed it required real poverty of the imagination to think that Black folks would only take delight in literature by Black authors. As he explained in Macon County, Alabama, I read Marx, Freud, T.S. Eliot, Pound, Gertrude Stein, and Hemingway. Books which seldom, if ever, mention Negroes were to release me from whatever segregated idea I might have had of my human possibilities. And people like Frederick Douglass said similar things, by the way. Literary critics insisted on placing Ellison in the company of Richard Wright and Langston Hughes, but Ellison himself cited Hemingway and Faulkner as far more important influences than any of his fellow Black writers. Reading books offers a chance to escape one's own provincialism. According to Ellison, this wondrous, imaginative, inspiring, sometimes disorienting or disturbing experience of reading texts is all but foreign to social justice lit, where familiarity and proximity reign supreme. What a loss this is. So true. I am currently reading in a read along with an educator on Facebook. I'm reading Les Miserables. Now, it's mostly told in the voice of a man about a man. There are women in there too, and so he is both man and woman, the author. But it is so heart tugging and gut wrenching and beautiful. And I cannot imagine going through my life without having read this book. I can't. It is adding immeasurably to my enjoyment of my life right now to read this book. It is over 1,000 pages. So therefore, I read a chapter a day. It will take a year. There are 365 chapters, but the language is so glorious that I think any student who likes to read would be missing out in a big way to not read this book. There's no way they'll read it in a school or any portions of it. By predetermining which texts will speak to whom based on crude racial and cultural categories, we potentially deprive people of some of the most transformative reading, like this, experiences they may have. Here, for example, is how one inmate at a Missouri correctional facility described his experience playing the role of Hamlet in a prison theater production. This gives me an opportunity to see a society beyond what I'm used to. I'm familiar with rap music and videos and big butts in the TV and all that, but let me come back to something that I'm not familiar with. Let me get into something else. That did open my eyes into getting into reading Sylvia Plath and Frost and Wadsworth and different other people. Laura Bates, a professor who started a Shakespeare program in Maximum Security Prison in Indiana, was in awe of some of the prisoners' interpretive chops, noting that they were able to make sense of some passages that professional Shakespeare scholars have struggled with for 400 years. And part of the reason is that these classic themes are very often about just regular people's lives, the plight of human existence. And sometimes it takes somebody who's going through, not something absolutely the same, but going through a trying time to relate to that. Whereas a professor who's, spent all their time reading these books might just miss it, might just gloss right over it because their life is the life of the scholar. They're not just out there living as the characters would be, or maybe as the narrator was. So even though they live very different lives, hundreds of years apart, there's something in that core theme they can relate to and they'll pick up on it. I've seen this happen. I've seen this happen with students that I've tutored. So you're depriving your students if you don't give them access to this. It is Ruth Simmons, though, the first African-American president of an Ivy League institution who has the most devastating rejoinder to those who believe that some literary traditions will not or cannot appeal to particular readers. Asked in a 60-minute interview why she, a tenant farmer's kid from the wrong side of the tracks of this country, decided to study French literature, she replied, "Because everything belongs to me. There is nothing that is withheld from me simply because I'm poor. That's what children have to understand." And then the next thing, remember I hinted at the beginning, was this tyranny of presentism, that everything isn't right now. We can't go back in the past and talk about those themes and even look at people's lives back then, because it will be impossible, even without a history class, it will be impossible to miss progress. You won't be able to miss it. And one of the things that social justice warriors and the woke desperately need these students not to know about is the progress that has already occurred. In order for them to believe that we live in this horribly unjust, terrible place and we have to hurry up and fix it because so many people are suffering and have suffered, we cannot possibly show them how good they have it. Think about it for a second. If they were able to look at that and go, wow, I'm really glad that I'm not Jean Valjean, and that even as bad as prison is today, wow, they can't have that. They can't have that. Social justice lit insists that the classics have no more and no less literary merit than any other works. So the value of teaching classic literature is reduced to present-day concerns, either by transforming reading into an exercise in calling out a text's problematic and outdated ideas, or by using the text as a springboard to discuss socially relevant topics through social justice prism. Some books are so problematic they should simply be struck from the curriculum, according to Disrupt Text founding member Lorena Gimron. They feature characters that are straight up racist or sexist. We can replace those texts. God forbid we see what that looks like. And, I don't even agree with using that solely to say, look how racist he is. Usually there's a lot of other things going on in that story. You can talk about it. Certainly I wouldn't avoid it, but to have that be like the only thing we look at, racist, or just throw it out completely, and maybe there's a whole book behind that. By this yardstick, we would no longer teach Heart of Darkness, but we would also no longer teach the likes of Huckleberry Finn, Invisible Man, and The Bluest Eye. In the event that you must teach Shakespeare's plays or other classic texts because of prescriptive school policies, or of your own free will. Social justice educators insist the only responsible way to do so is by disrupting them. When teaching Shakespeare, 8th grade English teacher Christina Torres urges teachers to call out the misogyny in The Taming of the Shrew, the racism in Othello, and the anti-Semitism in The Merchant of Venice. And it sounds like I'm contradicting myself when I said, well, they do this presentism so you don't notice progress, but I'm not, because instead of calling out these isms to the students and saying, this is, this is something that was more normative then. And now obviously it's shocking to us today because of the progress. Instead of looking at it that way, it's like bad, evil, bad, ick, don't look at it, don't read the bad words. It's just like a religious teacher telling you to tape over the dirty words in a book, or notice that don't say the dirty words, right? And that's very different than calling it out and saying, yes, look at this perspective. Can you imagine that today? No, you can't, because progress. When I read Romeo and Juliet with my students, Torres reports, I pause, give a thumbs up, thumbs down, and say boo when the play says something misogynistic. This is just what I said. It's like a religion. Boo, ick, no. This turns reading literature into a whack-a-mole game of spot the problematicism. It encourages students to take a self-righteous, judgmental stance toward fictional characters, scanning text for any sign that they fail to live up to today's socially progressive standards. And how can you enjoy the story? Or how can you enjoy the characters? How can you find their humanity? With To Kill a Mockingbird, for example, Germain says that readers should have their attention drawn to the limits of Atticus's advocacy. He doesn't use his privilege to bring about change. He is part of the very system that let Tom die. Without exposing these and other flaws in To Kill a Mockingbird, Germain says that teachers uphold the racism it presents. With white students in particular, Germain uses the book to introduce them to anti-racist ideas and critical race theory to help them see the racism in the text and in their own lives. Take a wonderful classic book that has so much to teach and is written so well with such wonderful characters, and limit it to scolding people. It's just criminal. It makes me sick. As a lover of literature, it makes me sick. Social justice lit embraces a do not read between the lines approach to literary analysis and interpretation. It fails to see that an author's portrayal of a racist or sexist character is not necessarily an endorsement of the character's worldview, but it can instead be a way of highlighting social ills and presenting sharp social commentary. Vexing, endlessly fascinating, and hugely important questions about an author's intent remain unaddressed. No, we can't think. God forbid we think critically or talk about these things critically or ask questions about why things are the way they are. Nope, it's got to all be, we are judge and jury over this author, these characters, etc. And then they all walk away feeling like they wasted their time, by the way, because that becomes repetitive. It becomes very, very repetitive. And you start to wonder, why am I even doing this? You start to hate reading. It becomes drudgery. They skim. They look at the notes, and they just pull out the problematic parts and they move on. So The Merchant of Venice is wholly and definitively anti-Semitic. There's no room to consider that Shakespeare's depiction of Shylock's treatment in the court of law might be a critique of discriminatory attitude towards Jews. And The Great Gatsby simply toes the line of perpetuating the myth of meritocracy. The Fitzgerald threw into sharp relief the ostentatious lifestyles of the rich and famous to critique materialism, social climbing, and the American dream is not even entertained. The word satire, alas, is foreign to the social justice lexicon. Have you ever noticed? I don't know if you've ever talked to or interacted at length with a young adult or even a college-age person who is of the social justice ilk. There's something very flat about their affect. There is something very superficial about the way they deal with things. When you talk about any subject, they immediately have an answer. There's nothing they simply say, I don't know about, except I don't know what it's like to be black. That if they're white, they might say that, but they don't look at these larger questions, as young as they are, as little experiences they have, and say, I really don't know. And I'm not sure what I think about that. No, they have an answer for everything. It's quick. It's flat. They don't understand satire very well. In fact, sometimes they think it's real. So, and then you'll notice the satire they like is not really satire so much as just mean. It's just mean. They don't really have a sense of humor. They don't. And they have no sense of self-awareness. They can't laugh at themselves. They take themselves entirely too seriously, which is a recipe for misery, if you ask me. If you take yourself that seriously, you are bound to be brittle and very unhappy in life, because part of how we bounce back from things is to have a sense of humor about them, especially over time. In a lovely short book called Breaking Bread with the Dead, English professor Alan Jacobs notes that the reader who instantly translates the subject or story of a book into present day terms often is not having a genuine encounter with the book at all. That is true. Unfortunately, the social justice lit approach to reading classics tends to produce painfully strained encounters that are anything but genuine. Teaching The Great Gatsby, one high school teacher assigns students different characters and has them complete a 43-step privilege walk activity in order to visualize how class prevented some from achieving the American dream. This is, I think you're getting the gist of this. So basically, the other problem is they talk about how exposing them to classic literature ends up being more just exposure to racism, sexism, and homophobia, not exposure to any other ideas around that or any kind of analysis. It's just flat. It's very flat, completely lacking in imagination. This is anti-intellectual. We've gone all the way full, to the other side from hyper intellectual to anti-intellectual, masquerading as intellectual. Because they're not, this is anti-intellectual. Don't think. Everything's flat. Um this is not to say there's no value in making connections between present day social concerns and literature, but that shouldn't be our exclusive or even primary concern. And the connections to the present shouldn't always be determined by social justice framework. Let's see. Without some familiarity with the canon, you cannot fully grasp the significance and beauty of newer works. Literary interpretation cannot be developed in a temporal vacuum. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone, T.S. Eliot declared. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. So she goes on. I will put this. She's an associate professor of history at Carleton College and the John Stuart Mill Faculty Fellow at Heterodox Academy. So, reading books from the perspective of judge, jury, and executioner is antithetical to cultivating the kind of intellectual humility and curiosity that is essential for rich, sophisticated encounters with different texts. It turns the study of literature into an exercise in judgment, and judgment is not the route to understanding. 100%. So, the irony again is that for people who put so much emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, they do not want to give equal access and equal attention to people and ideas of the past. They do not want a diversity of ideas or thoughts or interests or themes. They definitely don't want to include dead white men or even women for that matter if they're problematic. So they're liars, as we always knew they were. And even if you are not a person who's all that fond of literature, or even if your children are not, I can tell you as a teacher that it is really important to expose them to good literature when they're learning to read and learning to write and learning to think, because reading a wide variety of writing styles, genres, authors, not only builds their vocabulary, it helps them become who they're going to be. There's a famous line, and it's kind of a funny movie to refer to for this topic because it's such a serious topic. But if you ever saw Meg Ryan in You've Got Mail, there's a line where she says, "The books you read as a child become part of you the way no other reading does." And that is absolutely true when it comes to literature and classic literature. And your kids may complain and they may, it's hard. And some of it can be hard and some of it doesn't feel like it's all that, exciting or interesting, but it's worth it. And with a good teacher, a teacher who truly loves it, like I do, or who is passionate about it and can breathe life into it, to get them interested and help them see the challenge in it and the value in it, it opens the mind like few other things to other topics too. It can make I've seen kids read Jules Verne and suddenly become very interested in science where they weren't before. You can start to think about who you are and what you value in ways you wouldn't in other subjects. In school today, they're reading too many informational texts. There's not enough fiction, not enough encouragement to use their imaginations and to really think about where their values are. Literature does that. Literature does that. And I think they are depriving these kids in a very real way. It's very sad because as they get older and have to go out and work and be busy all the time, it's going to be much, much harder for them to have time to do this kind of reading. and they likely won't. I mean, I'm still reading, but that's because I was taught about these things when I was younger and I understood the value of it. And they're missing out on that. It's a very big, important part of life. And like I said, I think they're doing it on purpose. They don't want them to perceive project progress. They don't want them to feel good about people who are different from them. They want them to just be little, judges going around pointing. Everything's a struggle session. All of life is a struggle session. God forbid we have a sense of humor about things. Anyway, if you like this sort of content, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel, comment on this video, like this video, share this video. That's the video.